The woman sitting before the Venetian silver mirror no longer recognizes her own reflection. The hands, once celebrated by their elegance by holding on zephyrs and calm crowds, shake slightly as they adjust a pearl necklace that once belonged to the Empress of Austria. The silence of the palace echoes like a sentence. There are no more courts. There are no more subjects awaiting audience. There is no more constant murmur of power being exercised. Only she, Marie de Edinburgh, the queen who turned Romania into a cultural and diplomatic power, now reduced to a ghostly figure in her own home. The mirror reflects not only a 60-year-old woman, but decades of a Europe that has disappeared forever, along with the idea that royalty could be both divine and human. The palace around her whispers memories she would rather forget. In Carrara, marble corridors, where once echoed the hasty steps of ministers and ambassadors, now only the night wind produces sound. The Persian tapestries she personally ordered in Isfahan during her diplomatic honeymoon, hanging faded by the decades of Mediterranean light. Official portraits that document 40 years of reign observe it with eyes that once seemed alive, but now reveal only the coldness of the paint on screen. Marie understands, with a clarity that terrifies her, which has become a portrait of herself. If you appreciate stories about the silent decline of the European aristocracy and how extraordinary figures sailed the end of an era, consider subscribing to the channel. We explored the lives that shaped the 20th century through its most intimate tragedies. Marie Alexandria, Victoria de Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was born on October 29, 1875, in Eastwell Park, Kent, daughter of Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, and Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia. His childhood was among the golden halls of three empires, British, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian, at a time when Europe still believed in the eternity of its monarchies. Granddaughter of Queen Victoria and Tsar Alexander II, Marie grew up accustomed to the idea that the world belonged to her by divine right. But it would be precisely this inheritance that would become, decades later, the cruel weight of carrying when history decided to rewrite the rules of power. The 19th century had created a complex network of dynastic marriages that transformed the European aristocracy into a single, extended family. Marie was a cousin of future German emperors, related to Romanov Russians, connected by blood to the royal houses of England, Spain, and Greece. This web of kinship defined not only its marriage possibilities, but its fundamental understanding of how the world worked. For Marie, politics was family diplomacy, and family diplomacy was the art of balancing personal affections with strategic needs. She would never imagine that she would live to see this whole system collapse under the weight of nationalisms and ideologies that made royal blood irrelevant. At 18, Marie had already learned that her beauty was a political currency. The golden hair, arranged in elaborate waves according to Victorian fashion, framed a face that the painters of the court described as angelic, but with the intensity of a Greek goddess. He wore a navy silk dress with Brussels lace details as he walked through the palace Mediterranean gardens where the family passed the winter. Each step was calculated, every rehearsed gesture, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. She knew she was being observed, evaluated, measured as a piece in a dynastic chess game that stretched throughout the continent. San Antonio's garden had been designed to impress illustrious visitors, with marble paths that serpent among centenary orange trees, and sources that reproduced classic motives. Marie knew every angle that favored her portraits, each stone bench that provided the best background for conversations, photographed by journalists. His education had not only included languages, literature, and music, but also the subtle protocols of public visibility. She had learned to smile in a way that suggests intelligence without threatening fragile masculinities, the gesture with elegance that did not seem theatrical, to maintain the posture that communicated real dignity without arrogance. In that fall of 1893, the telegrams arrived daily from several European courts. Royal blood applicants disputed his hand, the future Jorge V of England, Austrian archdukes, German princes. But Marie had already made her choice, or rather her choice had been made by her. Ferdinand of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, heir to the Romanian throne, was the man who offered not only love but the chance to build a kingdom, far from the oppressive shadows of the great powers. Ferdinand had been educated in Germany, but his hair in Romanian offered Marie something that no other suitor could provide, the opportunity not to be merely consort but co-founder of a modern dynasty. The 1893 Romania represented all that the old European powers considered peripheral. Newly independent of the Ottoman Empire, with an insecure aristocracy of its traditions and a national culture still in formation, the country offered Marie a blank canvas where it could paint its vision of real modernity. She didn't want to be another decorative princess in an established court. I wanted to be a founder, visionary, the queen who would transform a peripheral kingdom into cultural power. There was, in this ambition, an almost male headquarters of power that its housekeepers tried to suffocate, but which only intensified over time. The decision to accept Ferdinand was not only romantic, but deeply strategic. Marie had carefully studied Romania's geographical position, her growing importance as a supplier of oil and grains for Western Europe, her potential as a cultural bridge between East and West. She saw possibilities that the established powers ignored by prejudice. Romania could become the Balkan Switzerland, neutral, prosperous, culturally sophisticated, and she would be the architect of this transformation. The engagement was announced in January 1893, and preparations for the wedding began immediately. Marie spent hours studying Romanian history with teachers, brought especially from Bucharest, learning not only the language, but her regional nuances, her formal and colloquial records. He memorized local nobility genealogies, studied detailed maps of the provinces, decorated names of rivers, mountains, and cities that would soon be part of his dominion. She knew that getting to Romania as an ignorant foreigner would be the first step to failure. He needed to become, from the first day, more Romanian than the Romanians themselves. Her sisters watched her with a mixture of admiration and pity. Victoria Melita, who would marry the Grand Duke of Hesse, and Alexandra, intended for the Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, envied the freedom Marie would find in Romania, but feared for the isolation that would represent. They would remain at the center of the European aristocratic system, with constant visits between relatives, seasons in Baden-Baden and Marienbad, the security of belonging to a social network that extended from London to St. Petersburg. Marie was choosing golden exile, the chance to reign over a kingdom that Europe was barely recognized as civilized. But Marie already understood what her sisters didn't see. The center of the European system was beginning to rot. The old powers became increasingly rigid, attached to protocols that lost meaning, dominated by old men who did not understand the forces that were transforming the continent. On the periphery, in Romania, the Balkans, and the Eastern Europe, there was room for innovation, experimentation, the creation of new ways of exerting real power. Marie intuited that the future would belong not to the established empires, but to countries that could reinvent themselves faster. Marie's marriage to Ferdinand on January 10, 1893, had been celebrated as the social event of the decade, bringing together representatives of all European royal houses at Sigmaringen Castle. But it was only when he stepped on Romanian soil 3 years later, she understood the magnitude of her task. The Romania of 1896 was a country that struggled to define newly independent of the Ottoman Empire, oscillating between the Russian and Austrian influence, with an insecure nobility of its own traditions. Marie saw in this fragility an extraordinary opportunity. Installed in the Palace of Skin in the roller coasts, it began to reimaginate not only its own image, but the visual identity of the whole kingdom. The palace, built by King Carol the Martyrs in a bold mixture of German neo-Renaissance styles and Carpathic architecture, offered the perfect scenario for his cultural synthesis experiments. Marie ordered dresses that combined Parisian elegance with traditional Romanian embroidery, creating a style that was simultaneously international and national. He learned folk songs that sang in diplomatic receptions, not as exotic curiosity, but as a statement that Romanian culture deserved the same respect as the Italian opera or the operetta Viennese. Each public apparition became a lesson of visual anthropology. Marie made a point of being photographed wearing Byzantine jewelry redesigned by local artisans, combining them with tiaras who had belonged to Austro-Hungarian emperors. She ordered carriages that reproduced traditional Romanian reasons in gold and bronze, but with proportions that rivaled the English state carriages. Their gala dresses incorporated embroidery techniques that the peasants' Esses de Moldova dominated centuries, but executed in lion silks and Genoa velvet. Each public gesture was a statement. Marie was not only Queen of Romania, she was the personified Romania in her most sophisticated form. His early years as a princess heiress were marked by the strategic maternity. Carol was born in 1893, Elizabeth in 1894, Mary in 1900, Nicholas in 1903, Ileana in 1909, Mircea in 1913. Each birth was celebrated as a dynastic consolidation, but Marie experienced motherhood as a constant tension between public duty and personal desire. She loved her children with the possible intensity for an educated woman to subordinate maternal impulses to political needs, but also saw them as extensions of her own ambition. They were the future ambassadors of their view of modern monarchy, the living specimens, that it was possible to be simultaneously real and human. Children's education became another cultural engineering project. Marie insisted that they learned Romanian before any other language, who were photographed wearing traditional clothes at folkloric festivals, who participated in Orthodox ceremonies as seriously they showed at protocol events. But it also assured that they received cosmopolitan education, English housekeepers, French teachers, seasons in international resort. They would represent the perfect synthesis between national identity and European sophistication. In 1906, with Ferdinand's rise to the throne, Marie finally assumed the role for which she had prepared for over a decade. The coronation was a carefully orchestrated spectacle that revealed its mastery of the symbols. She used a crown designed especially to highlight her stature, high enough to impose respect, delicate enough not to masculinize her features. He dressed in fabrics that evoked both the Byzantine tradition and Western sophistication, in a combination of colors that reproduced the Orthodox palette, but with cuts that followed the latest Parisian trends. He took his oath in perfect Romanian, without foreign accent, with a diction that the linguists considered purer than that of most natives. The international press acclaimed her as the most beautiful queen in Europe. But Marie knew that beauty was just the wrapper of a much more ambitious project. She was creating a new royal model for the 20th century, less hieratic than the British monarchy, less military than Prussian, less ornamental than Austro-Hungarian. Its real majesty version combined calculated accessibility with authentic dignity, cosmopolitan modernity with national rooting. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated performance that required intelligence, discipline, and an intuitive understanding of how images work in the formation of collective identities. The following years were of intense diplomatic and cultural work. Marie turned Bucharest into an art and literature center, inviting writers, painters, and musicians from all over Europe to homes at Romanian court. George Enescu debuted compositions in palatial saraus that Marie organized with the accuracy of a theatrical entrepreneur. Constantin Brancusi received its first important commissions through contacts that the Queen established between Parisian patrons and Romanian artists. She herself began writing tales, memories, political reflections, always signing with pseudonyms that allowed her to express opinions that would be controversial from a queen. His correspondence with figures such as Oscar Wilde, Anatole France, and Richard Wagner revealed a sophisticated mind, capable of transiting between international politics and aesthetic theory with equal ease. The letters she sent to Wilde during her last years in Paris show a woman who understood both the scandal mechanics and the importance of social rehabilitation. His epistolary friendship with France revolved around discussions about the role of intellectuals in the formation of national consciences. With Wagner, she debated the possibility of creating a Romanian national opera that was simultaneously epic and modern, able to rival Wagnerian cycles without imitating them. But it was perhaps in his educational initiatives that Marie demonstrated more clearly her long-term view. She founded schools that combined French pedagogical methods with curriculum that emphasized Romanian history and culture. He established scholarships that allowed young Romanian talent to study in Paris, Vienna, or London, but on the condition of returning to apply their knowledge in national development. He created institutions that formed not only an educated elite, but an elite that saw cosmopolitanism and patriotism as complementary, non-conflicting values. These initiatives revealed their understanding that the modernization of Romania, and it could not be just superficial. It was not enough to import architectural styles or clothing fashions. It was necessary to create a national intellectuality capable of dialoguing equally with the European cultural centers, but proud of their roots. Marie was building the cultural infrastructure that would allow Romania to actually become a medium-sized European power. World War I had completely reconfigured the European map, and Marie de Romania emerged from the conflict as one of the most respected political figures on the continent. During the 4 years of war, she had turned palaces into hospitals, sold personal jewelry to finance military effort, personally negotiated with Allied powers leaders, and maintained national morale during the most desperate moments of the Austro-German occupation. When he arrived in Paris for peace negotiations, he was no longer just a decorative consort queen, but a true statesman who had tasted her competence in the most extreme tests. The war had shown that Marie had not only political intelligence, but physical courage and emotional resistance that even surprised her admirers. During the advance of Kaiser's troops by Moldova, she had categorically refused to evacuate to exile, remaining in Iași with Ferdinand and keeping a government functioning that many considered ghost. I visited military hospitals, where injured soldiers arrived in numbers that overwhelmed any available medical infrastructure. He personally organized food rationing in besieged cities, negotiated with enemy commanders the exchange of prisoners, using their fluency in German and their family connections to achieve humanitarian conditions that saved thousands of lives. Most importantly, Marie had understood before any other Romanian leader that the war represented a unique historical opportunity to definitely resolve the national issue. The Romanian provinces, still under Austro-Hungarian dominance, Transylvania, Bukovina, Banat, could finally be incorporated into the kingdom if she could convince the Allied powers that Romania deserved to be treated as a partner, not as a protected. This understanding led her to risky strategic decisions, including the declaration of war on Austria-Hungary against the Council of Ministers who preferred prudent neutrality. Installed in Ritz's presidential suite, Marie received diplomats, journalists, and political leaders in a hall that she had redecorated to simultaneously evoke French elegance and Romanian identity. Traditional Karpatos rugs covered Louis XVI furniture, Orthodox icons shared space with Impressionist paintings that it had ordered by Romanian French, inspired French artists, and Marie circulated among the guests wearing Worth creations that incorporated embroidered motives by Moldova artisans. Every detail was a political statement. Romania was not a smaller country seeking recognition, but a cultural power that deserved to be treated as equal. His negotiations with 14 Wilson points were masterful. Marie had carefully studied not only American politics, but Wilson's psychology, his Presbyterian education, his convictions on national self, determination, his tendency to positively respond to arguments that combined moral idealism with geographical pragmatism. It presented the Romanian cause not as territorial expansionism, but as a restoration of a cultural unity artificially fragmented by the Central Empires. Transylvania would not be a military achievement, but a reunification of populations that shared language, religion, and historical traditions. With Clemenceau, she adopted a completely different approach. The French Prime Minister respected only intelligent strength and cynicism, so Marie emphasized the strategic aspects of the Romanian question. An enlarged Romania would serve as barrier against future German or Russian expansions. Romanian oil resources offered France an alternative to oil controlled by potentially hostile powers. Romania's geographical position would allow France to maintain influence on the Balkans without having to keep permanent troops in the region. Lloyd George had different challenges. The British Prime Minister was genuinely interested in creating a stable European order, but had little knowledge about the ethnic and religious complexities of the Balkans. Marie spent weeks educating him about the history of the region using ethnographic maps she had ordered especially for negotiations. He explained how the borders proposed to Romania followed natural divisions, religious, linguistic, economic, that would make the country more stable, no less. Demonstrated that a territorial satisfied Romany would be a factor of stability, Giononal, while a frustrated Romania would inevitably become a focus of irredenticism and conflict. She sailed between French arrogance, British pragmaticality, and American idealism with a skill that impressed even her hardest critics. Clemenceau, notoriously misogynist, admitted that Marie was the only royal man in the Romanian delegation. Wilson, initially skeptical of Romanian territorial ambitions, was gradually conquered by the articulation that Marie did between national self, determination, and geopolitical stability. Lloyd George, who arrived in Paris considering Romania a minor question, ended the convinced negotiations that a strong Romania would be fundamental to the European balance. The success was extraordinary. Marie got not only the annexation of Transylvania, Bukovina, and Bessarabia, territories that doubled the size of Romania, but also international recognition of her country as a legitimate regional power. The Romania Mare that emerged from the 1919 to 1920 treaties represented the complete realization of his strategic vision. It had turned a peripheral kingdom into one of the largest and most influential nations of Eastern Europe. But it was during these weeks in Paris that Marie began to realize the first signs that the world she had learned to operate was beginning to disappear. The old rules of European diplomacy, based on dynastic alliances and aristocratic prestige, were being replaced by economic and ideological considerations that it understood intellectually but did not dominate intuitively. The young U.S. diplomats treated her with courtesy protocol, but she saw in her eyes a poorly disguised impatience with all the monarchical pomp. They represented a future in which kings and queens would be, at best, decorative figures in constitutional democracies. Even more disturbing was the news from Russia. The execution of the Romanov had eliminated an entire branch of their extended family, but also demonstrated that real secretity offered no protection against ideologies that completely rejected the legitimacy of the monarchy. Marie realized that success in Paris could be, paradoxically, the last victory of a condemned political system. She had played the dynastic game with absolute mastery precisely the moment this game was losing historical relevance. At 50, Marie de Romania had become the embodiment of a time that was coming to an end. Sitting in her private office, decorated with gifts from kings and emperors from around the world, she reviewed correspondences that revealed the growing instability of her position. Letters from exiled relatives from Russia told stories of humiliation and poverty she could barely imagine. Concerned telegrams of German cousins who lost titles and properties described a Europe where being an aristocrat had become almost a mark of misfortune. Reports of his counselors about the growth of Republican movements in Romania herself suggested that her kingdom was not even immune to the forces that swept the continent. The correspondence with the exiled Russian royal family was particularly painful. Cousins who had grown in palaces that rivaled Versailles now lived in modest apartments in Paris or London, depending on the charity of fortunate relatives. Uncles who commanded imperial armies worked as translators or language teachers. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, whom Marie had met as one of Europe's most elegant women, sold jewelry in second-hand stores to pay rent. These stories functioned as distorted mirrors that showed possible future that Marie preferred not to contemplate. She had spent 3 decades meticulously building her public image, and now that same image became a prison. Each public appearance required hours of preparation that became increasingly elaborate as she aged. The right dress was no longer enough. It was necessary to consider the lighting that most favored nascent wrinkles. The angles of photography that minimize the loss of firmness in the neck, the jewelry that distract attention from age signs that no cosmetic art could fully conceal. Marie had become an actress playing Queen's role, but she was beginning to forget who it was when the curtains closed. Maintenance of the real persona required a constantly growing staff. There was the manicure that came daily to the palace because Marie's hands could never appear careless in official photographs. The French hairdresser who permanently lived in Bucharest to ensure that his hairstyles remained at the avant-garde of European fashion. The Italian seamstress specializing in adaptations that disguised inevitable body changes. The official photographer who dominated techniques of retouching that made their portraits increasingly distant from their royal appearance. Marie was becoming a collective work of art, created by a team of professionals who kept alive an illusion that she themselves began to consider oppressive. Her children, who should be the continuation of her legacy, became constant sources of anxiety that she could not express publicly. Carol, the heir, had been involved in romantic scandals that staining the reputation of the royal family. Her obsession with Magda Lupecu, a woman considered socially inadequate by the Romanian aristocracy, created political crises that Marie needed to resolve discreetly. Elizabeth suffered from severe depression that medicine of the time could not treat properly, and refused to comply with public duties that Marie considered essential to dynastic legitimacy. Mary had made a disastrous marriage to King Alexander of Yugoslavia, who ended in the scandalous divorce that reverberated in all European courts. Only Ileana and Nicholas seemed able to carry the weight of the real inheritance without breaking under his pressure, but Marie saw in them the same wearness that was beginning to consume it. They fulfilled their duties with professional competence, but without the genuine enthusiasm that had characterized their own rise. For them, being real was a job, not a vocation. Marie understood that she had created functionally competent heirs, but emotionally distant from all that traditional royalty represented. They would be the last of their lineage to exercise real power, and knew it. It was at this time that she started writing her memories compulsively. Pages and handwritten pages and pages obsessively, where it tried to make sense of a life that had been simultaneously extraordinarily successful and deeply empty. Marie discovered, with increasing horror, that she could not separate her personal accomplishments from her public role. She had become so completely queen that she had lost access to the woman who existed before the crown. He tried to remember moments of genuine personal happiness, but his most lived memories were always of diplomatic triumphs, successful receptions, photographs that captured exactly the image she wanted to project. Memories became a painful archaeology of a personality that had gradually disappeared under layers of public performance. Marie recalling the girl who had been in Malta, curious about the world, animated by the possibility of adventure, genuinely in love with Ferdinand. But this girl seemed to belong to someone else, someone she had known briefly before assuming responsibilities that completely turned her. The woman who wrote the memories was competent, sophisticated, historically significant, but also deeply lonely in a way that power could not remedy. The nights in the palace extended in oppressive silence that cruelly contrasted with the decades of constant social activity. Ferdinand, always more fragile than her, had become a dark figure who preferred the military history book company for conversation. They dinnered together in silence protocol, each lost in contemplations that could not or did not want to share. The halls where Marie had received the big names in European culture now echoed empty, decorated with portraits and objects that documented past glories. The new generation of Romanian intellectuals preferred Bucharest coffees to palace soirees, and Marie began to understand that her cultural relevance was also coming to an end. The young writers and artists she had patronized during her rise now found inspiration on political ideologies that fundamentally questioned the legitimacy of the monarchy. Romanian literary modernism developed in conscious opposition to the aesthetic values that Marie had promoted. Where she had emphasized harmonious synthesis between tradition and modernity, they celebrated radical rupture. Where she had promoted aristocratic cosmopolitanism, they defended popular authenticity. Where she had built cultural bridges with Western Europe, they sought national identities that reject foreign influences. Marie realized, with a lucidity that was terrified of her, who was becoming irrelevant to the country that had dedicated her life to modernize. The 1925 Romania was prosperous, culturally sophisticated, diplomatically respected, all she had dreamed of. But this Romania no longer needed a queen who personified her aspirations. The country had matured beyond the need for dynastic symbols. Paradoxically, the full success of her project made her unnecessary for her continuation. Ferdinand's abdication in 1927 and his death a year later left Marie in an impossible position to define. As a mother queen, she oracly kept prestige and influence, but the political reality of Romania of the 1930s had no room for the diplomatic methods that had done their glory. Carol II, who took over the throne after a turbulent period, had a completely different view of the role of the monarchy. More authoritarian, less ceremonial, fundamentally modern in his efficient brutality. He had studied emerging dictatorships in Europe and concluded that the kings of the 20th century needed to be political executives, not cultural symbols. Marie took refuge in Balsic, a palace she had built on the Black Sea coast during her most powerful years. Architecture, an audacious fusion of Byzantine and Moorish styles, reflected its old confidence in mixing traditions to create something entirely new. The White Towers rose over gardens that combined English roses, Mediterranean cypresses, and aromatic plants of the Balkans and botanical symphony that had impressed visitors from all over Europe. But now, walking through the gardens where she had received kings and ministers, she felt like an actress revisiting an abandoned theater after the audience had lost interest in the play. Balsic's quarters, intact the decoration that Marie had created to impress diplomats and intellectuals. Byzantine mosaics reproduced scenes of Romanian history with techniques that she had learned directly from Ravenna artisans. Persian rugs, she had personally selected in Isfahan, covered marble floors imported from quarries that once belonged to the Roman Empire. Libraries contained first editions in a dozen languages, many with dedication from authors who had been their guests, each object documenting cultural connections that had defined their identity for decades, but now seemed relics of an extinct civilization. The days were structured around rituals that lost meaning, but that Marie could not abandon. She woke up at 8, as she had done for 40 years of public life, and was wearing the same careful care. She still chose jewelry that complemented the morning light, still arranged her hair according to protocols that had memorized decades earlier, still made up as official photographs were taken at any time. But there were no more hearings to grant, official letters to respond, or public appearances to plan. She kept the forms of royalty in a vacuum of power that made each gesture simultaneously worthy and pathetic. Breakfast was served on the porch that offered a panoramic view of the Black Sea, using porcelain of Sèvres decorated with the Romanian royal monogram. Marie reads correspondence that was increasingly spaced, letters from old friends who had also lost social positions, protocol invitations, to events she knew how to be gestures of empty courtesy, reports of lawyers about property she still had, but who lost value as Europe was industrialized. The morning reading routine, which had once been a briefing on state issues, had become a melancholy collection of reminders that its influence had evaporated. His memories became the only project that still brought him genuine satisfaction. Writing in English, French, and Romanian, the three languages in which he thought about equal fluency, Marie tried to crystallize not only her own experience, but a whole civilization that was disappearing. She revisited dances in Vienna, where she had danced with archdukes who later died in the war, negotiations in London, where she had convinced ministers who later lost elections, coronations in Bucharest, where she had celebrated an illusory dynastic permanence. Each page of the memories carried the painful awareness that he was documenting a dead world. Correspondence with old friends and relatives around Europe revealed the same pattern of elegant decline. Russia's exiled British Anastasia wrote from a modest apartment in Cannes about her attempts to sell imperial jewelry to American collectors. The Archduchessa Isabella, deprived of her properties in Austria, described her piano classes for children of nouveau riche, who paid well for her children to be educated by a true aristocrat. Countess Margot, widow of an Austro-Hungarian diplomat, reported her experiences as a tour guide in palaces where she had once been invited to honor. They had all lost positions, properties, relevance, but kept an elaborate courtesy that disguised shared despair. The letters discussed literature and philosophy with genuine sophistication, but carefully avoided mentioning the political realities that made their lives increasingly precarious. It was a collective exercise of elegant denial, where heavens educated to exert cultural influence pretended that they still had the material means and social platforms necessary for this influence. Marie understood that these correspondences were more than mutual consolation. They were desperate attempts to keep a cultural language alive that was losing speakers. They wrote about music, art, and literature as if these issues were still political relevance, as if aesthetic opinions could still influence decisions that affected millions of people. It was a sophisticated form of collective madness, where intelligent women refused to accept that the world had changed in ways that made their education and experience completely irrelevant. The afternoons in Balkic extended to a succession of activities that Marie had developed to occupy hours that were once filled with state responsibilities. She, gardening personally, wearing silk gloves to plant roses that no one but the servants would see. He painted watercolors of sea landscapes that revealed genuine talent but would never be displayed beyond the walls of his private quarters. He translated French poems to Romanian, an exercise that allowed him to maintain fluency in languages he no longer used for diplomatic purposes. Each activity was a way of pretending that his mind still served a greater purpose than entertainment itself. Marie's return to Bucharest after years of semi-exile in Balkic was marked by a solemnity she tried to interpret as ceremonious, but who knew how to simply be funeral. The Romanian capital had changed completely during its absence. Wider avenues cut historic neighborhoods that it recalled as charming mazes, concrete and glass modernist buildings, replaced palaces Belle Époque that had sheltered their court. An aggressively contemporary urban energy pulsed into spaces that had no place to real or monarchical ceremonial processions. Marie moved through a city that had helped build but now treated her as a vagative historical curiosity. Installed again at Cotrocini, she found that the royal rooms had been partially converted into administrative offices that served the modern bureaucracy of the Romanian state. His private halls remained untouched, a courtesy protocol of Carol II, but the rest of the palace was now housed officials who processed documents, organized files, and made decisions according to logical people, alien to courtesan traditions. Marie saw young bureaucrats circulating through the corridors where she had received German emperors and French presidents, carrying cheap leather pastes and speaking on the phone with informality that made her feel invisible. The apartments reserved for them kept all the decoration of their years of glory, but now they worked as a personal museum where she was both healing and last visitor. Official portraits documented 4 decades of evolution in the art of the royal portrait. From the former, where he appeared as a hesitant young princess, to the latter, where his pose revealed the authority of a consummate statesman. But watching this gallery of herself, Marie realized that she was contemplating the visual biography of a person who had ceased to exist. The woman of portraits had purpose, influence, future. The woman who watched them was a survivor without function. It was at this time that she began to understand that her greatest mistake had been believing that she could control her own historical memory. For decades, Marie had cultivated her public image with the care of a gardener, selecting that aspects of her personality would be photographed, what opinions would be cited by the press, that symbolic gestures would define her legacy. She had created a public version of herself that corresponded exactly to her view of how a modern queen should be. But now it would find that collective history has its own logic, independent of individual will. The young Romanians, those who had been born after the Great War and grown in the expanded Romania she had helped to create, saw her as a representative of a time they wanted to consciously forget. For them, Marie symbolized not national modernization, but commitments to foreign powers that had delayed genuine independence. They preferred completely national heroes, figures that did not carry the ambiguity of foreign origins and international dynastic connections. The cosmopolitan sophistication that had been his greatest strength had become his greatest weakness in an age that valued national authenticity above diplomatic competence. Their public appearances have become increasingly rare and progressively more embarrassing. When I accepted to inaugurate a hospital or receive a foreign delegation, Marie perceived A. We look at a mix of protocol reverence because it was still technically a mother queen, and poorly disguised impatience with rituals that seemed to consume time that could be used more productively. The young diplomats who accompanied her on these occasions treated her with professional courtesy, but she saw that for them she was a bureaucratic obstacle, not a source of political wisdom. The Romanian press, which for decades had obsessively documented every public apparition of yours, now covered its events with some protocol lines buried on the internal pages. The journalists who had built careers analyzing their dresses, their jewelry, their facial expressions, had found new objects for their attention. Marie read these brief stories with a morbid fascination, recognizing in them the process of their own erasure. She was gradually becoming a historical figure while still living. The nights in the palace stretched in almost absolute solitude that contrasted cruelly with decades of dinner with 20 or 30 illustrious guests. Marie had dinner alone in a lounge, designed for 50 people, served by servants who performed centenary protocols with mechanical accuracy, but without any spontaneity. The ritual of dinner, which had once been an exercise in cultural diplomacy where she knew writers, artists, and politicians from all over Europe, had become a solitary performance where she played the role of queen for an employee audience who would rather be at home with their families. After dinner, she took refuge in her private library, a room that contained more than 10,000 volumes in 12 different languages. There she relayed her own letters and diaries in an archaeological attempt to find evidence that her life had had meaning beyond public theater. But he discovered, with increasing horror, that even his most intimate thoughts had been shaped by the needs of his public persona. His personal reflections sounded like speeches. His private observations were formulated as being intended for publication. Her deepest doubts were expressed in the diplomatic language she had learned to use to mask vulnerabilities. Marie tried to remember moments of genuine authenticity, moments when she had forgotten to be queen and had simply been a woman. But these moments were very rare and increasingly distant. Perhaps a few moments of intimacy with Ferdinand during the early years of marriage, before political responsibilities consumed all their mental time. Perhaps a few hours with their young children before she understood that they were also instruments of their dynastic strategy. Perhaps some conversations with intimate friends before she realized that all her friendships had political components. The library had become the only space where Marie could admit to herself the extent of her loneliness. There, surrounded by books that documented centuries of human thinking about politics, art, and philosophy, she faced the terrible possibility that she had sacrificed her individual humanity in exchange for historical significance, and that, in the end, she could lose both. The books offered intellectual consolation, but also constant evidence that other people had managed to live complete lives without renouncing private personality. Marie had chosen a form of existence that made it impossible to distinguish between public success and personal fulfillment, and now she found that she had lost both. The disease came as a release disguised as a tragedy. Marie, at 62, found that cancer she was consuming offered her something that decades of power had never provided: the possibility of abandoning public performance without losing dignity. For the first time in 40 years, she had a socially acceptable excuse not to meet the expectations that had defined her existence. Death approached as the only honorable retirement available to a queen who had forgotten how to be anything else. Confined to private quarters, Marie spent her last weeks revisiting obsessively the objects that had composed her material world: jewelry that had belonged to Russian emperors, a necklace of emeralds that Tsar Alexander III had given his mother, diamond earrings that had decorated the orejas of Tsar Maria Feodorovna, a tiara that had been redesigned 3 times to adapt to the changing modes, dresses worn in coronations and state balls, preserved in cedar cabinets with the same reverence that other families dedicated to religious relics, photographs that documented half a century of European diplomacy, organized on Moroccan leather albums that it had created as personal archives of an era. Each piece carried memories that, and she tried to organize in some kind of coherent narrative, but found that her life had been, above all, a succession of roles interpreted with increasing perfection. The young woman who had married Ferdinand, the princess who had learned Romanian, the queen who had negotiated in Paris, the diplomat who had won territories, the mother who educated heirs, the widow who had preserved traditions. All these characters seemed to have been interpreted by the same extraordinarily competent actress, but Marie could no longer identify the person who existed before any of these roles. Her children visited her with appropriate protocol regularity, but Marie realized that they were also relieved with the prospect of her death. She had been an impossible mother, simultaneously loving and strategic, protective and manipulative, always subordinating maternal impulses to political needs. Even in times of greater family intimacy, Marie had been unable to forget that her children were princes and princesses before being her children. Now, finally, they could exist without carrying the weight of their unfulfilled ambitions and without fear of disappointing impossible patterns of dynastic excellence. Carol II, concerned about the succession and international challenges that accumulated rapidly, visited the mother, often descending. Marie realized that he saw her as an obstacle to the modernization of the Romanian monarchy, closely linked to the old European alliances, very nostalgic of a world that had permanently disappeared, very attached to ceremonial forms that had no place in an era of authoritarian efficiency. She had spent decades preparing her son to take over the throne, but now he understood that the kingdom he would inherit would be fundamentally different from what she had built. Carol II needed to be a fascist king to survive the 1930s. She had been educated to be a liberal queen in an age that had no room for aristocratic liberalism. Conversations with doctors revealed not only the inexorable progress of the disease, but the complete transformation of the outside world. It was spoken of imminent war in Europe, fascist movements that threatened the last constitutional monarchies, revolutions that would definitely sweep the traces of the ancient aristocratic order. Hitler had attached Austria, making obsolete the alliances Marie had grown for decades. Stalin had consolidated his power in the Soviet Union, eliminating any possibility of Tsarist restoration. Mussolini had transformed Italy into a dictatorship that mocked the parliamentary traditions that Marie had helped implant in Romania. Marie listened to this news with the serenity of those who had died symbolically years earlier. The world that was disappearing in the seizures of the 1930s was a world in which it had been supremely competent. The world that was being born from the ashes of this collapse would not have a place for women like her, sophisticated, multilingual, diplomats by temperament, educated to exercise power through charm and cultural competence. The new European leaders were brutal men who despised everything she represented. They preferred mass propaganda to individual persuasion, organized violence to elegant negotiation, ideological purity to cultural synthesis. In recent days, Marie has asked her to bring to her forth the official portraits that documented her evolution as a queen. Contemplating these images, she tried to understand what exact moment she had lost access to the person who existed before the crown. The first portrait of 1893 showed a young woman with 18 with eyes that revealed genuine curiosity about the future. The last, 1935, showed a 60-year-old woman who had seen too much and understood everything too late. Between these two images was documented not only a life, but the end of an entire civilization. Marie died knowing that she had been the last of a kind, the last queen in the traditional sense of the word, the last woman to exercise real power through cultural competence, the last aristocrat to genuinely believe that social class imposed moral obligations. She had been too perfect for her time and too inappropriate for the next season. Her absolute success as a traditional queen had made her completely irrelevant to the modern world. Marie de Romania died as she had lived, theatrically, but alone. His last words, whispered to a nurse who barely understood Romanian, were a quote from Virgil about the foundation of Rome, Tantae mollis eth Romanum condem people. So hard was to found the Roman nation. Even dying, she could not abandon the tendency to transform personal moments into historical statements, to find in classical literature the words her own experience could not formulate. Was cremated according to his expressed desires, at a time when cremation was still considered radical to members of Orthodox royalty, a last gesture of modernity that no one else was paying attention to notice. Its funerals brought together representatives of European royal houses who, within a few years, would be dead, exiled, or completely marginalized. Prince Paul de Yugoslavia, who would be deposed in 1941, King Boris of Bulgaria, who would die mysteriously in 1943, King Carol II of Romania, who will abdicate in 1940 and will die in exile. The procession that followed his coffin through the streets of Bucharest was the last great monarchical ceremony of Romanian history, a ghost procession celebrating the death of a time that had ended years before any of them admitted. World War II, which began a year after his death, definitely eliminated the world in which Marie had learned to operate. Romania was successively occupied by Germans and Soviets, lost territories she had conquered in Paris, saw her monarchy abolished, and replaced by a socialist republic who considered her memory a bourgeois inconvenience. The palaces where she had reigned were transformed into museums, government offices, or homes for Communist Party officials. His jewelry was confiscated as the property of the people. Its portraits were removed from public buildings and stored in museum deposits where decades would remain without being displayed. Today, few remember that there was a queen who turned Romania into a cultural power, who personally negotiated the borders of a country, who wrote in 3 languages and corresponded with the great names of European literature of her time. Marie de Romania disappeared from collective memory not because she failed, but because she had too much success in a game whose rules were being rewritten while she played. She was the last great queen in the traditional sense of the word, a woman who used charm, intelligence, and real determination to exert royal power in a world dominated by men. Precisely for this reason, it became irrelevant when this world ceased to exist. Its story reveals something disturbing about the price of female perfection in public contexts. Marie built such an elaborate and convincing persona that she was completely lost inside her. She became a character interpreted masterfully by an actress who forgot who she was before taking the stage and found it too late, that there was no way to descend without destroying everything she had built. His tragedy was not failure, but the absolute success of a project of self-transformation that left it without access to humanity itself. The sophistication that made her an incomparable diplomat also isolated her from basic human experiences. The intelligence that allowed him to sail the complexities of European politics also prevented her from accepting the simplicity of genuine relationships. The discipline that turned it into a perfect queen also deprived her of spontaneity that makes life bearable. Marie got everything a 19th century woman could ambition, but she paid a price that only exceptionally ambitious women can completely understand. The palaces where Marie reigned still exists. Some turned into museums where tourists photograph empty halls, others converted into offices where bureaucrats process documents in a language she would not recognize. But all are completely empty of the kind of life it represented. A life where each gesture carried symbolic weight, where appearance and substance were unexplainably confused, where power, exerted through intellectual seduction and meticulously calibrated cultural performance. Marie de Romania was the last woman to intuitively understand that, at certain historical times, being queen meant being simultaneously a work of art, political instrument, and human sacrifice. She accepted all these functions with absolute competence, but found that the price of absolute competence is the impossibility of being anything but competent. She died knowing that she had built a magnificent kingdom, and that this kingdom would disappear with it, taking with it not only her political achievements, but the very idea that power and culture could be exercised by a single person with enough elegance to make the beautiful authority. Perhaps this conscience was, finally, its only truly personal victory, to die understanding exactly what had created and lost, without illusions about legacy or posterity, but also without regrets about choices that had ultimately inevitable for a woman of her intelligence and ambition born at a time that offered only 2 options: decorative irrelevance or creative self, destruction. Marie chose self-destruction, but managed to make her so beautiful that she became art. She T-Rance-proved jewelry and shields, but found that no shield is strong enough to protect against historical irrelevance. She went, even the last sigh, a queen in this. At a time she had stopped believing in queens, turned out to the most cruel and paradoxically the most elegant of curses.